What's up everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to make this sci-fi scene in Blender. We will be using geometry nodes to make the main sci-fi object, but hopefully I'll be able to break it down enough for you to follow along if you're new to geometry nodes. Okay, so without any further ado, let's jump straight into it. Okay, so I've opened up Blender and we are actually going to use the default cube this time. So we can delete the light and the camera, and then we just have the cube. So I'm gonna head straight over to geometry nodes and create a new geometry node tree, then press Shift A, and first of all we want to add a cone. We can delete the group input and plug the cone's mesh into the output. Now I want this to only have 3 sides, so we can turn the vertices down to 3. We're going to be subdividing this a lot, so I want to be able to see the wireframe. So if we scroll over here to this overlays drop down, click that, then we can enable wireframe. Now let's add a subdivide mesh, drop that in. Now you want to add a separate geometry, drop that in. And we want to set this to face. And now we want to duplicate the subdivision and put it over here. The thing is, we only wanted to subdivide random faces. So let's add a random value node and plug that into the selection of the separate geometry. And let's turn this to Boolean and plug that in again. Now you can see it's deleting random faces, but we still want the full object. So let's add a join geometry node, plug that in there, and then we can plug the inverted into the join geometry. Now you can see we are subdividing some faces and we're leaving others as the same. So I want to repeat this a few times, and we could do this by duplicating all of these nodes and then plugging them in again, but we can use a repeat zone to make this way faster. So let's plug the subdivision mesh into the geometry, then we can plug the iterations into the geometry of the separate geometry, and then plug the join geometry back into the repeat zone and plug that into the output. And we actually want to plug this geometry socket in instead of the iterations. But now we can just increase the iterations and it subdivides it more. I also want to set the subdivision level to 2 on this one, and I'll increase the probability a little bit. So we actually want to put this subdivision mesh into the inverted socket instead. You could leave it in the selection path, but I prefer having these big chunks of unsubdivided mesh at the top. You can see the difference there. Now we want to extrude some of these faces and extrude them randomly. So let's again add the separate geometry and the random value node. Bring those over here. Plug that in. Then we want to add a extrude mesh node. Plug the inverted into the mesh. And then add a join geometry and plug the selection into that join geometry. Then plug that back into the output and plug the extrude mesh into the output of the join geometry as well. Now we have this crazy extruded mess. We can duplicate the random value, set this to float, and let's plug this into the offset scale. I'll set the max value to 0.24 and the min to 0.05. Okay, that is looking good. I'm going to set up the materials now so we don't have to do that later. So let's go to the material tab and I'll just call this one red and make it fully red, and we can put that in. So let's add a set material and select the red one. Let's click the plus to make a new material, call this blue and make it fully blue. Now we can duplicate the set material and change it to blue. Let's go to material preview. You can see the blue is like being applied to the non-extruded parts of the mesh, and the red is being set to the extruded parts. Okay. So that's the basic setup of the node tree. It's not too complicated and hopefully you could follow along. Now one more thing I want to do is add a bit of wireframe to this underlying mesh. So I'm going to duplicate the mesh and then duplicate the geometry node tree by clicking this 2. And then we can just delete all of these nodes here. I'll plug this into the output. And then we can go to the modifiers and add a wireframe modifier. It's looking pretty good. Nice. And let's name the wireframe. Okay. We can also name the main one main object, and I'll add a bevel modifier to that. We can zoom in and increase the segments and turn the offset down a bit. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's go back to our layout, and I want to enable cavity, so let's go to this drop down, click cavity, and change it from screen to both. Now we can see the edges and stuff a lot better. So for the landscape, I want to use an add-on called ANT Landscapes. So open your settings, go to Get Extensions, and you can just search for Landscape, and then there'll be ANT Landscapes. So you can just install that and then make sure it's enabled. Now if we press Shift A, we can go to Mesh and add a landscape. Now straight after you add it, before you click or press any buttons, you can go down to this little drop down panel at the bottom here, and there's a bunch of operator presets. So there's all these different terrains, but the one I found the best is Canyon. So we're going to use that one today. Now we can just scale it up pretty big like that, and let's move our object over here and move it up, and I want to add a camera, and then we can go to camera view, and I'll press Shift tilde key, which allows us to control the camera like a video game with the WASD keys, and I'll position it somewhere over here, something like this. And then let's go to the camera properties and make the focal length like 75. Now I'll select our two objects. Something like that looks pretty nice. We can also move it up and rotate it a bit. And I'm also going to select the camera again, go to viewport display, and turn passepartout all the way to 1. This is just a personal thing I like. You can decide if you want this or not, but it basically just puts everything to black that is outside of the camera. It's only a viewport thing, so it doesn't matter for the final render as well. I'm going to add a subdivision modifier to the landscape, set that to a level of 1 in both render and viewport, and then apply it. Now I want to also add a bit of water, so I'll add a plane. Go to top view, and just scale it up a bunch. Move it over. Go to camera view and then just move it up. Something like this looks good. Now let's add some materials. So I'm going to go up to the shading tab. Let's go to render properties and change the render engine to cycles and enable GPU compute. And I also need to change the feature set to experimental. We'll need to use an experimental feature later on. So let's change this blue material first. I'll call it glow, and let's just go to emission and change the strength to like 30. Then let's go to our red material and call this metal. Now I'm going to delete the principled BSDF and add a metallic BSDF. Plug that in. Let's turn the base color down to something like this, a very dark gray, and I'll leave the edge tint at a pretty white value. Now we want to add some breakup to this, so I'll add a noise texture, a mapping node, and a texture coordinate. I'll plug the object socket into the vector of the mapping and plug the mapping into the noise. Then we can view this, just plug it into the material output, and let's make the scale something like 4.4 or something like that. Plug the metallic back in, and let's plug this into the roughness. Now we can add a color ramp, drop that in, and just increase the black value a bit. Let's also apply the metal material to the wireframe, and I do have it selected, but the geometry node tree isn't showing up, so we have to go back to modifiers and select the geometry node modifier. Then we can add a set material in and make this metal. I want a rock material for the landscape. Open up your browser of choice. I'm just using Arc, and just search for ambientcg.com. Then we can just search for rock, and I really like this one right here. You can pick whatever you want, and then I'll just download the 4K version. Now back in Blender, let's select our landscape and make a new material. We can just name this rock. Now open up your file browser, and these are all the files that came with it. We want the displacement, the color, and the roughness. So let's drop those 3 into Blender, and they're a bit spread out, so I'll scale them in and move them up. Now we can plug the color into the base color of the landscape, and it doesn't really look like rock. So let's tab into edit mode, A to select all, U to unwrap, and then Smart UV project, and unwrap that. Looking a bit better now, but let's add a mapping texture and a texture coordinate. Again, let's plug the object into the mapping and the mapping into the base color. And before I forget, I'll plug the mapping into the other 2 image textures. Now for the displacement, I want to add a displacement node, obviously. Plug the color into the height, and then we can just plug this into the material outputs displacement socket. Might set the scale to like 0.02, and I'm also going to add a subdivision modifier to it. And then we want to enable adaptive subdivision. This is the experimental feature that we wouldn't have been able to get if we didn't enable the experimental features. I also set the dicing scale to 2. And I actually want to change the texture coordinate from object to UV. And I'll make the scale something like 10. That looks good. And you might notice that even though it looks like we have displacement, the object itself isn't actually being displaced. So to fix this, we need to go to the material properties over here and down to settings. And then under surface, we have this displacement option. We want to change that from bump only to displacement and bump. Now you can see it's going a bit crazy. This won't work very well in Eevee. So let's head over to cycles. And I'll also click the drop down and disable scene lights and scene world. Let's change the scale down a bit. 0.01 looks good, so let's leave it at that. And then we also want to plug the roughness into the roughness of the material. I'll just rearrange this a bit. And I want to add a color ramp to adjust this further. Make some room, add a color ramp, and I'll just bring the Y value in a bunch. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Now we need to make the water material. I want to displace this plane to make it look like it has water ripples. So tab into edit mode and just subdivide this a bunch of times. Tab out of edit mode and I'll add a new material. Call it water. Let's make it fully metallic and turn the roughness down. And I'll add a noise texture, and let's add a texture coordinate and a mapping node again. Plug that in. We can use the object coordinate, and then we'll get a displacement. Plug that into the height and plug this into the material output. Let's set the scale to like 2.5 or something. Turn the detail up, and then I'll set all of these to 10. You can see we have some ripples. I'll set the Y to something like 18 though, and then you can see it looks like the wind's blowing it a bit more. I might set the scale on the displacement to 0.001 just to make it a bit more subtle. Yeah, it looks pretty nice. Now I'm going to go back to our layout, and I want a nice nighttime HDRI to add to this. So open up your browser again and just search for Polyhaven and head to polyhaven.com. Then we can go to HDRIs, and I'll just search for something like night. I like the look of this one, so let's click on that and let's just download that. Go back to Blender, go to the world properties, and let's click on this little yellow dot in the color section here. Click on that, go to environment texture, and then open up our HDRI. Now we can go to our rendered view, and you can see we do have our HDRI in now. I'll just bring up the timeline and change this to the shader editor and go to world, and then we can also add a mapping and texture coordinate node to this, and I want to rotate this down a little bit and rotate it round to a spot that I think looks decent. I like this spot, it's got a nice rotation, and we can see some of the stars, so that looks pretty good. I'll just bring this down again, and it is very dark at the moment, so I'm going to add a sunlight. Just move that over here a bit. Let's set the strength of the sunlight to 1.5, and I'll just give it a super pale yellow color, and then we can just rotate this till we have some nice shadows. I think something like this looks pretty nice. We can go back into camera view and have a look, and now we need to add some fog. So I'm going to press Shift A and just add a cube, and then we can scale this up a bunch and scale it on the Z a bit and move it so it's sitting on the floor. I'll head back over to camera view and back to the object shader, make a new material, delete the principled BSDF, and add a principled volume. And then let's plug this into the volume socket of the material output, and I'll set the density to 0.02. Okay, that's nice, but I think I want to rotate our objects a little bit. So I'll select the main object and the wireframe object and press R twice to enable trackball rotation, and just give that a bit of rotation. Okay, that looks nice. I want to add a bit of depth of field to the camera. So select the camera, go to camera properties, and enable depth of field. Let's set the focus object to our main object, and I'll set the f-stop to 0.4. I also want to add a bit of rim lighting to our main object. So I'll add a area light, and I'll just hide the volume cube for the moment and bring this area light over. Let's go to object view, and I'll just position it somewhere at the back like this. Scale it up and give it a bit of rotation like this. Make sure it's not clipping into the mesh as well. Something like that would be nice. Let's set the power to 100 and have a look at this. That's nice. It does give it a bit of lighting at the bottom, a bit of rim lighting. It's a subtle difference, but it does do something. We are getting a lot of light in our scene as well, which I don't want. So we can link this light to only our main object. So select the light, go to object properties, down to shading and light linking, make a new light link, and then we can drag our main object in and our wireframe object in. So now it's only affecting that object. Okay, that's looking pretty nice. Let's go to render settings, down to color management, and make it medium high contrast, or even high contrast. I'll go with medium high. And then let's set the render samples to 312 and just give this a render. Now before this gets too far, I have noticed that the ripples in the water aren't too clear, so I'll cancel the render, select our water material, and make it something like maybe 0.008. And for some reason the Y was set back to 10, so I'll turn that back to 18, and that looks fine. You might be able to rotate it a bit as well, and let's render it out again. Okay, so it's finished rendering. Let's close that and head over to compositing. Click use nodes, and I'll bring this timeline down as well. First of all, let's add a glare node. That is way too much, and we don't want it to be streaks, so let's change it to fog glow. Let's make the strength like 0.48 or something. That's good. Also add some lens distortion in. Let's change the distortion to 0.01, enable fit, and the dispersion to 0.05. Now I'm going to add a Voronoi node texture, and we can make some noise for this image. Then I'll add a mix color, drop that in, and change it to linear light. Let's view this in Voronoi texture, and I'll make the scale something like 300. We can leave everything else as B and plug that into slot B, and then we can view that. That is way too much, so let's turn the factor to like 0.01. Now we have some subtle noise. Make sure to save, and then we can select our viewer node, go to the node panel in the N panel. You can press N to open it, and then we can just click save this image and just click save. Okay, so that's about it. I hope you learned something from this video and enjoyed it. If you like this sort of content, make sure to subscribe. And with that said, I'll see you in the next one.